well. But yes, China is going to be hugely influential in how the world changes in the next 4 decades, but sometimes in ways that might be surprising, I think, to people looking at it today. China is not going to grow at double-digit rates from here to 2050. In fact, by 2050, China will be probably growing at about 2.5% a year in its economy, and it'll actually be an older society, not only than Europe, but also than America.
You mentioned India, and of course, India too is going to develop tremendously fast, faster in many ways than China. It's going to be bigger in terms of population and possibly in terms of economy by 2050. What that means is in some ways quite frightening. I mean, there is one statistic in this book that says that the number of cars on India's roads could increase by 3,880% by 2050. I mean, I can't begin to imagine what that means.
Well, that's all other things being equal if Indians consumed cars at the same rate as others have. So something else might, certainly Indians' roads would have to change considerably for that to be possible. They're already pretty chaotic as it is. It represents the sort of challenge that exists for on all sorts of fronts, but clearly environmental. That raises the question of if Indians bought very large numbers of cars and proportionate to the sorts of numbers you see on America's roads, clearly that would be a huge environmental challenge. And also how the raw materials that are going to be needed to satisfy this sort of demand are going to be created, and how do you create the infrastructure to make it possible?
How far do you think the different political systems in China and India, the one an authoritarian regime, the other a democratic regime, how far is that going to influence their development?
China faces a political transition over time to some sort of version of something that perhaps resembles more like democracy, and I think that's widely recognized even within China itself, that the current political system, as more and more people get wealthier, have higher expectations and are already starting to voice their opinions in all sorts of ways, that has to come about. India has democracy of a rather rowdy variety at times already. So it's a more chaotic sort of picture. India is able to absorb the sorts of pressures involved perhaps more effectively. So over the long term, you might think India has advantages, as well as a much more dynamic, as you said, much more dynamic demographic profile.
There is a chapter on science, and that makes one forecast, quite a bold forecast really. It says that development in chemistry has more or less come to a halt. Development in physics, likewise. The science where there is huge potential is biology.
You know, in such books you try to see the big picture, and that's a very striking, big assertion that chemistry is essentially quite a tired discipline, and that physics is, the big discoveries have perhaps been made, whereas biology is a great new frontier and can interact in a very fertile way with other disciplines that have developed very rapidly, nanoscience and information science. And this sort of extraordinarily creative buzz between those worlds can yield a lot of understanding, a lot of breakthroughs in areas like medicine, for example, understanding of the very detailed mechanics of different cancers, where you could perhaps expect to see great progress.
Another prediction you make, a very clear prediction, is that by 2050 we will know which other planets have life.
Yes, well, or at least that's a pretty good bet, that we will discover that, and that's because the tools for looking for them have got much better, and there are all sorts of probes out there looking in clever ways for ET, if you like, put very simply. So although space, yes, it's not going to be the great new era, it seems, of colonizing other planets as might once have been foreseen, but there are still excitements there in terms of that sort of discovery, and indeed of private space travel, which is likely to be a big growth industry in the coming decades. And there are new countries getting into the game in a big way. China is obviously there, India will be there. So there's more competition as well.
The big imponderable in all of this, of course, is climate change, and that has the capacity, doesn't it, to derail all the other predictions that you make, because if climate change has adverse effects that prevent the world, for instance, from feeding this enormous growing population, and basically all other bets are off, do you think you have underplayed the significance of climate change?
I think there's no escaping the fact that this is the greatest challenge to the planet over the coming decades. But there are lots of different ways of approaching it, not a single magic bullet that will suddenly solve it, because we've seen that that's not going to happen.
The Economist is a sort of glass half full publication, and this is a glass half full book, isn't it?
It's certainly optimistic, but I think it's not a question of ignoring the very real and very large challenges that the world faces. It's rather a faith that human ingenuity can overcome them, but in order for it to do so, you have to actually worry about them. You have to fret over these issues, and you have to really work at them. So it's not a confidence that everything will be all right. It's a belief that human ingenuity can overcome these difficulties.
Daniel Franklin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.